North Korea has walked away from the armistice that ended the Korean War in 1953. The decision is seen as a response to the latest UN sanctions and recent military drills between the US and South Korea. But with the two sides still technically at war, could this move lead to an armed conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Jane Dutton. A declaration of war or a call for help. North Korea has scrapped the armistice that ended the Korean War 60 years ago and shut down a humanitarian hotline with the South vowing to turn its neighbour into a sea of fire. The tensions come as the US and South Korea begin conducting their annual military drills, a move that has provoked the latest threats. The drills come days after the UN approved new sanctions against North Korea after its nuclear test in February. Now, these military drills are often met with strong rhetoric from the North. They are joint drills known as Key Resolve. They last for 2 weeks with more than 13,000 troops involved in the exercise. And since the beginning of this month, another joint exercise known as Full Eagle, an annual combined field training drill between the two allies, has also been taking place. Well, as we mentioned earlier, North Korea appears to have cut off the only line of communication between Pyongyang and Seoul. So what is the so-called Red Cross hotline? Well, it was set up in 1971. It is used to communicate between the North and South, which do not have diplomatic relations. The line is tested every day, but according to a South Korean government spokesman, an attempt to call Pyongyang failed on Monday. It's not the first time the North has severed its only point of contact with the South. It's done so 5 times in the past, most recently in 2010. And North Korea has issued multiple threats to pull out of peace agreements with the South. And on Monday, state-run media confirmed the country had pulled out of all of its agreements of non-aggression. Pyongyang was referring to 2 agreements made with its southern neighbour. The first is a bilateral pact signed in 1991 that endorses settling disputes peacefully and preventing accidental military flare-ups. And North Korea has also broken the 1953 armistice agreement that brought an end to the war. That agreement led to the two countries' current borders and demilitarized zone. It also called for a solution of the Korean question, which 60 years later remains far from resolved. Well, let's talk about this further with my 3 guests. From Seoul, Choi Jong-Kun, Associate Professor from the Department of Political Science and International Studies at Yonsei University. From Washington, D.C., Richard Weiss, Senior Fellow and Director for Center for Political and Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. And joining us on Skype from Nottingham, Steve Tsang, Professor of Contemporary Chinese Studies at Nottingham University. Steve is also Director of the China Policy Institute. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen. Choi Jong-Kun, I'm going to start with you as this action is taking place on your border. What is the response in South Korea to your neighbour rejecting the 1953 armistice?
I mean, we're not nullifying from our side the armistice truce agreement just because North Korea unilaterally declared they will nullify the armistice agreement. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to respond by nullifying it also, because since it is international agreement between multiple number of states, as long as we keep it valid, that armistice agreement is still valid, regardless.
How seriously is the leadership taking this, and what about South Koreans themselves? I should imagine they're a little bit nervous.
I mean, South Korean leadership is in the very early stage of, its administration. We just elected our new president. New president got just sworn in. We were shuffling our cabinet, and in the middle of all this transition, we have this looming large North Korean threat. But at the end of the day, South Korea is a very strong state with a very strong military establishment. So we are a very institutionalized state. So regardless of the institutional transition, South Korea is responding to North Korean threat very proportionally. So every time North Korea is trying to escalate, we're trying to keep it calm. But on the other hand, we have a lot of, this is democracy, so therefore we have many media outlets trying to make a lot of noise and buzz out of this North Korean threat. So in reality, we're trying to keep it very calm, but the media outlet and media coverage has been rather bumpy, if you know what I mean.
Okay. Richard, how's the US viewing this? I mean, is this effectively a declaration of war?
Well, as the previous guest mentioned, we've been down this road often, all too often. The typical North Korean tactic is to make these outrageous threats, talk about returning Seoul into a city of fire, of launching preemptive nuclear strikes against the United States, grabbing the world's attention, and then trying to bargain for some kind of concession, be it fuel oil, be it acceptance of their nuclear deterrent. And so the problem is there's no
there's a
real
difference
effective
in
way.
the tempo of this, isn't there? I mean, he certainly ratcheted up on previous threats.
Right. These threats, I think the wording is not so different from what we've seen in the past. What is really unfortunate, though, is there was a hope that with the transition to a new leader, there would be a change. And there are changes in domestic policy in North Korea, but for whatever reason, their foreign policy hasn't changed. It could be that this person, Kim Jongun, accepts the opinions of his father. It could be that the military still controls foreign policy. So Kim Jongun has no real authority. We just don't know. But we've seen these threats before.
So you're saying that again, the policy is military first?
From their point of view, correct. Now, the U.S. and South Korea, there's no good answer to this in the sense that we can't really end the threats. We could just make sure they aren't carried out, and we're doing that through diplomacy, through defenses, and through other measures.
Steve, China, as relaxed?
Well, the Chinese are not exactly excited about how the North Koreans are behaving. If anything, I think the Chinese government is disappointed with the way how the North Koreans are escalating at the time when the Chinese were trying to find ways to re-establish some sort of an effective dialogue, which would be, from the Chinese perspective, beneficial to the North Koreans.
But how often does China have to be disappointed before China does something that makes an impact?
Now, the problem here is that the Chinese are already very fed up, very, very disappointed, and disappointed far too many times, but they are still not going to do anything about it, and the North Koreans know it. The main reason here is that the North Koreans know that the North Koreans is about the only last true friend that the Chinese Communist Party, in contrast to China, still has in the world, and the Chinese Communist Party is not prepared to see the Korean Workers' Party collapse, and therefore they can afford to blackmail the Chinese much the same way they are blackmailing South Korea and the United States and the rest of the world.
Jong-Kun, is that a bit disappointing for South Korea? Would they like to see China do more? I mean, they're hearing now that China's disappointed, and this is probably the last time they're likely to be disappointed, but don't they want to see something tangible?
I mean, it's not a matter of how much China is disappointed with North Korea regime. From South Korean perspective, I think Chinese behavior has been rather consistent. In other words, China is the only major actor in this South Korean peninsula setting that promotes the idea of stability and peace. Therefore, they're not trying any action very radical. However, recently, as we all know, United States and China put its hands together and passed a Security Council resolution right after the third nuclear test. So I think that China is trying to take a very gradual action, send the signals to North Korea, and they may join in the international community trying to condemn and constrain North Korea's vigilant behavior. But one thing that I need to emphasize is that it doesn't really matter whether North Korea and China are friends or not. What happened here is that they are really strategically interdependent. From Beijing's perspective, they do not want to see very unstable North Korea. from Pyongyang's perspective, they do not want to totally alienate Beijing's position in this their very adventuristic behavior. So that I think there are strategic interests that links Beijing and Pyongyang together. So that I think that at the end of the day, Beijing, Xi Jinping's new government is pretty much limited. Although at international stage they try to coordinate international support and sanction toward North Korea, but whether Beijing is actually implementing or not is something that we need to wait and see.
Richard, do you think these sanctions will only have an impact if China works out how to implement them? Because at this stage we know very little about these sanctions are likely to affect.
Well, that has been a problem with past sanctions. There have been several rounds of sanctions adopted by the UN Security Council, which are mandatory on the international community, as well as a lot of sanctions adopted by Japan, the United States, and so on, which China can accept or ignore as it wishes. But the Security Council resolutions, China votes for them, and so you would think that that would mean that they have an obligation to fulfill them. But as we know, the Chinese are cross-pressured in the case of North Korea. They don't. I mean, I feel very sorry for the Chinese. I wouldn't want to have a neighbor like North Korea, and it's very provocative. They don't like the nuclear tests. They don't like the missile tests. It's just driving the United States to build up its military forces in the area. It's encouraging defensive moves in Japan and South Korea, which all could hurt China. But the real fear is that it would be worse if the government there collapsed. So they want to change the regime's behavior,
because
but
of
not change the regime.
Expected refugee problem.
That's a problem that's listed. It's probably not the main one. I think that's a bit exaggerated. I mean, there are a lot of things that could happen if you were the Chinese point of view. The worst would be if reunification occurred and the American military moved north and put one on your border. That probably wouldn't happen, but I'm sure they fear that. You could imagine a civil war between the generals there, which gets sucked in and drags in South Koreans and the United States. All that nuclear material, what could happen to it? Maybe it'll go loose. Maybe the terrorists, as the Chinese see it, in Xinjiang or elsewhere, will get a hold of it. If the economy there collapses and the U.S. and Japan have to put in a lot of money to help it recover, well, then that's going to take a lot of the investment that's now flowing to China. It's going to start flowing into North Korea and to recover. We saw that in the case of Germany, how expensive that was. All sorts of nightmares they can imagine. So from the point of view of the Chinese, what they have now is bad, but they could think of worse things to happen. So they're going to wait on the status quo. And I think their strategy, or maybe it's just a hope, is that over time, North Korea will follow the same path China followed. I mean, under Mao, the Chinese would make these same kind of threats. Why don't we just have a nuclear war? We'll kill a million, 100 million Americans, 100 million Soviets, 100 million Chinese, but then the Chinese will still win because they have more people. That's what, they made that kind of rhetoric. But they've now, as we know, they've graduated from this. They behave much more responsively when it comes to nuclear affairs and other issues. And I think that their hope is they can encourage the same kind of reforms in North Korea that they followed. And they've been trying their hardest, but so far it's had minimal success. Okay,
now the latest escalation in rhetoric comes off the back of rising tensions over the last few months, and I think Richard touched on a few of those. In February, North Korea announced it had successfully staged an underground nuclear test, its third to date. Then last week, the UN responded by voting in new sanctions against Pyongyang. China joined the United States to impose further sanctions, leading some to ask whether Beijing is changing its position towards its troublesome ally. Before the vote, North Korea had threatened to fire a missile at the US and warned South Korea of a nuclear war. Jong-Un, for the first time, people in South Korea are saying that maybe South Korea should get its own nuclear weapons.
Well, you need to reframe the question. In other words, not all South Korean citizens are demanding or even wonder and pondering about, South Korea's nuclear capability in the midst of all things.
Yeah, but several polls have been held, and the majority seem to want to go in this direction.
Yeah, there was a push poll. Basically, very few right-wingers are demanding South Korea's own independent nuclear capability. But we need to also deparse this South Korea's nuclear capability, because one group is demanding relocation of United States tactical warhead into the South Korean territory, and the other group is aiming for, our own nuclear venture. But if you look at very carefully South Korea poll in regards to this kind of question, many people argue South Korea should have our own peaceful nuclear capability, meaning that South Korea should be able to reprocess our spent fuels for the, our energy use, not for the nuclear weapon capability.
How does all of this play into, excuse me jumping in here, how does this play into the new leadership that you were talking about a little bit earlier on in the program? I mean, Ms. Park is well aware that South Koreans were rather disappointed in her predecessor for not taking a tougher stance against North Korea.
I mean, our Madam President Park's predecessor has taken very consistent, very aggressive stance toward North Korea. On the other hand, our nuclear capability, if we really want to go that route, South Korea has to sacrifice a lot of things. We need to withdraw ourselves from the NPT, which means that we'll become like a rogue state as we blame on North Korea, right? So that we're going to lose a lot of economic opportunities. South Korea is nothing like a North Korea. We are a global player, very formidable economic actor in the globalization era. We are trading states. So if we are to go against international norm of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, then South Korea will not, will have to assume a lot of costs, which rationally prevents South Korea from going nuclear route. So I think that our president knows very well. Her chief security advisor announced last week, regardless of whatever right-winger argue for our South Korea independent nuclear capability, will not go that route, because we know for sure that will cost so much, and also we will lose very important leverage toward North Korea. That is our legitimacy. Because our South Korea is legitimate in a way that we are defending non-proliferation treaty, and South Korea is working really hard, very peacefully, to establish a nuclear-free Korean peninsula.
All three of you seem to agree that this is just another example of North Korea possibly being belligerent and it's not going to take military action. Steve, let's talk about the why. Do you think North Korea is saying to China, don't side with the enemy, the US?
Well, I think the North Koreans are basically blackmailing everybody into accepting the North Koreans and do deals with the North Koreans. They know... I disagree with our American colleagues in terms of the ramifications that a collapsed North Korea could have for China. They are nothing quite as serious as he made it out to be. If anything, I think the Chinese can live without North Korea quite easily, in contrast to the Chinese Communist Party. The refugee problems would easily be resolved. There will be a united Korea if North Korea should collapse. And the North Korean refugees will choose to be second-class citizens in a united Korea rather than being third- or fourth-class citizens in a China that doesn't want them. So that problem will be temporary. And China already has far better relationship with South Korea than it does with the North. So a united North Korea is not going to be a problem. And if there is going to be a united North Korea, what justification would there be for the Americans to keep troops on the Korean Peninsula and indeed to push them north by the Chinese border? So all these issues means that the Chinese are
the US is certainly not going to be scaling down on its troops or its presence in the area after this, are they?
Well, what if the North Korean threat should disappear with an implosion of North Korea? On what basis would the Americans justify their presence on the Korean Peninsula? And the Americans will have huge problems with the South Koreans in terms of rehabilitating the devastated North and trying to persuade the united Korea to give up all its nuclear weapons.
What do you make of that, Richard?
A lot of things that will keep the the Koreans and the Americans and the Japanese very, very busy and not focus on China. So there's a lot to be said for the Chinese to lose North Korea. The only thing that stops the Chinese from wanting to lose North Korea is the implication of losing another Communist Party in power when there are already so few of them left. And the Chinese Communist Party's first priority is its own survival in power in China.
Okay, Richard, what do you make of that?
Okay, I agree with the scenario that our colleague is laying out is probably the best scenario from Chinese point of view. You know, you see your unified Korea that becomes sort of basically dependent on China for economic and security assistance. And that could well happen, but that's, as he's implying, that's not what's shaping the decision makers in Beijing. It's the Chinese Communist Party decision makers are seeing everything in the worst possible light. Collapse of one regime, maybe that could affect their regime. The American troops don't leave, etc. There is I think even under the benign scenario that our colleagues laying out, there's a good possibility U.S. troops will stay in Korea. We have the example of Germany, where the U.S. troops have stayed even after unification. Latest opinion polls show that the Americans are the most popular foreign country in Korea. A lot of they really rely on us for security. And if you were a unified Korea surrounded by an enormous China, Japan, which you're fighting over islands for, at least figuratively, concerned about a major Russia, you'd want an external balancer in there to help you maintain your independence. And the Americans are, they're a powerful country, but they're far away, so there's a limit to that. They won't want your territory. So you could see why they might want to keep U.S. troops, especially if the alternative with the U.S. troops leaving would be that South Korea then, or the United Korea would then want to have its own nuclear deterrent, which is the other means countries
on a little bit. Jong-Kun, one of the big unknowns here, of course, is if Kim Jong-un is smart enough to read his adversaries. I mean, how far is he likely to push this? We don't know that, do we?
I mean, obviously we don't know that, but let's think from the perspective of this guy, Kim Jong-un, right? He just got his power. He's been running the country for the last 1 year. But we tend to think in terms of our own framework, we tend to think in terms of 5-year term or 10-year term. But he might be running the country for the rest of his life, right? As his father did. So that he might have a 15 to 20 or 30 years of time frame as a tenure. So first years is nothing. In other words, what I'm telling you is that he might be playing this game with a longer perspective. Therefore, he's trying to play a very crafted game, whether he's being advised by his military or his civilian advisor. But the thing is that he's playing a very longer term, and he's being very, very careful. He's the one who said his rocket launch was failure, and then he attempted it again and he succeeded it. And then after the sanction imposed upon North Korea, as he committed himself, he basically tested and conducted the nuclear test and succeeded it. And then with another United Nations sanction being imposed, and then he's playing this sort of adventure game. What I'm telling you is that we need to be more prudent from our own side, because we are the one who is stronger, we are the one who is more united, and we are the one who is more capable of defending and deterring North Korea. We're essentially talking of a very paranoid and very weak country. Every time they impose some sort of threat on the South Korea or the United States, we only looked at not only their verbal action, but also, not much being implemented afterwards.
Okay, I just want to bring in some reaction very quickly before we run out of time that we've been getting on our Facebook page. Bob Sowler says, this is nothing new. Baseless threats and posturing have been a central aspect of North Korea's foreign policy for decades. They only use such bombastic language because they're insecure and impotent regarding real action. Ulrich Dahlgren thinks if they are really insane enough to attack, especially with nukes, they'll only be assuring utter destruction for themselves. And Vadim de Medici says, I'm located in Seoul and can say that life here is buzzing without mortal fear of an attack. This leads me to conclude that they've seen this before and that the looming destruction that is upon them is not taken as seriously as Kim hopes. And we hope that as well. Thank you, gentlemen, for talking to us. Choi Jong-Kun, Richard Weitz, Steve Tsang, and thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, please email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.